Hello and welcome! Modern Blink is back on the menu. The meta is just too fast, Ketramos had to go, I'm so sorry. But I added Aether Vials, Recruiter of the Guards, and also White Orchid Phantom and the Aven Interrupter in the main. I also allowed myself one less land and one more Fatal Push. Let's see how this build can do. In the sideboard there are also 3 High Noons and an Ashiok. Ashiok is there to fight the graveyard and also the Titan players. And just as I talked about it, speed. We need speed. And Modern is all about it now. Round 1, we are up against Izzet Prowess, one of the most aggressive decks in Modern right now. We need to be ready. The opening hand was not kind to us, not at all, so let's see how this goes. Enjoy the show! Even with 5 cards, I had a solid plan. Turn 1 Thoughtseize, turn 2 Overlord. My opponent also kept just 5 cards, which meant they only had 1 creature, so I just took it. It became evident that my opponent could not really develop their own plan, so I just continued doing my thing. Although I was quite unlucky as my Overlord just whiffed. My opponent did not get a land, so I just went for the Recruiter into Flicker Wisp into flipping the Overlord. I had plenty of time to do so. And even though my opponent got a Darcy, I was ready to deal with it, so I just played the Flicker Wisp, flipped the Overlord and got rid of the DRC via the Solitude. And even though my opponent found a land, they couldn't do anything else at the moment, so I just went for attack and continued grinding my value. I was getting even real close to playing Solitude for 5 mana, so that's why I chose to find a land. My opponent was developing too slow, there was basically nothing they could do, and even though they played the iteration, they did not find enough to fight me. The Emperor of Bones was a fabulous top deck, as I could just play it, get the Solitude, exile the Darcy via the Solitude and just go face for almost lethal. It became evident that my opponent could not keep up with this aggression. I just got ready to play another Solitude, but they just could because they had nothing. Now to sideboards. Wrath of the Skies and High Noons, those are the main cards. We do not need Thoughtseize. I also trimmed down on Flicker Wisp and 1 Emperor. In game 2 I kept a weird hand. There was a lot of setup, but I needed to find the payoff. With hindsight, I know that's the reason why I lost. I even got lucky with the Solitude, but we shall see if it's good enough. My opponent continued applying pressure, so I started to deal with that. First of all, I used 1 Solitude and just got it back via the Overlord. Now, Kori Steelcutter is a problematic card to deal with. I have ways of destroying it, but if it sticks, Solitudes are not good enough. Tokens everywhere, and that is the problem. I had to go for the Solitude play, but my opponent had a Lightning Bolt, so that was over. Wrath just to store energy and remove the token, but it's quite desperate. And now to the issue I expected. I had the setup, but I had no more cards, and my opponent just kept drawing and got rid of my graveyard. Tried to fight back, but actually playing Thalia here was not the best idea, as they had the removal and they had more damage. So, 1 lucky top deck. What is it? It's nothing. Alright, let's go to the last game. In the last game, I was ready for whatever my opponent was about to do. Double Fatal Push, Solitude, I just needed some development on my side of the board. I swiftly dealt with my opponent's DRC. I managed to top deck Emperor of Bones, so I just developed it to have something on board to fight my opponent. But my opponent decided having more DRCs was the way to go, so DRC number 2 and DRC number 3. Let's play a game. Spot the misplay. Well, it is there. My opponent continued developing their board and their creatures. They still had quite a lot. But even though my opponent had creatures, they did not put on a lot of pressure, so I had time to just chill and develop. But unfortunately I got into an awkward spot, because I wanted to play the Solitude for real, but I also wanted to be ready to use it. Fortunately, the Emperor of Bones was ready to just block. I was ready to use the adaptability, block with the DRC and just kill one of the Swift Spears. And even though my opponent tried to dig for some sort of answer, maybe Lightning Bolt, maybe Mutagenic, they did not find anything, so my block just worked and my 4/4 Emperor stayed on board. Here I had an interesting choice. Originally I wanted to go for Thalia and then Solitude, but the fact that I drew March and the fact that my opponent had open mana made me decide to wait one more turn with my play. This is also the reason why I played the Godless Rain tapped, so that my opponent would not know I have a Solitude. And as you can see, my opponent brought out the big guns. There is the Cory Steelcutter, there is the Monastery Swiftspear, a lot of creature going to their board. At that moment I knew I had to use the March. They had Spell Pierce, but I had 2 mana open. It helped them with damage, but actually it did not do that much. And now we are all set and ready. Double Solitude for my opponent, also Thalia to flick it. I think there is no way to lose this. And I must say, I enjoy doing it like this, even though it is quite brutal and my opponent had nothing to fight back. They tried to play the Unholy Heat, but even they realized it was over, so they just scooped. Round 2, I'm up against Urza Saga, Affinity, Modern Affinity. Let's see how it goes. And my opponent had a solid start. Turn 1, Cameo and Mox, that was great. But I was ready with a Fatal Push. So just to be safe and deny my opponent's mana, I kept the Fatal Push, killed the Tameo preemptively so that they would lose mana. But I did not know at the time they just had another Tameo. I kept the Ephemerate on top because I had the Flicker Wisp. I also kind of hoped for the Solitude and a big blowout for my opponent. And as luck would have it, I managed to find the Solitude. Although I chose not to play it yet, as I wanted to destroy more of my opponent's stuff because I had the Ephemerate. My opponent just went for more development of Artifact on their side and a second Urza Saga, which meant they were ready to just start creating large constructs. On my end, I had the Flicker Wisp, so I just went for it. And as expected, my opponent was ready with the Metallic Rebuke as strong reaction. But it also meant that my opponent was tapped out, so I just went for the Solitude Ephemerate play. And most importantly, the last card in my hand was the Emperor of Bones, which could actually get back the Flicker Wisp and continue my plan. Honestly, all hail the Emperor, because this card is bonkers. I just did exactly what I wanted, and evidently my opponent was not ready for it. I think they wanted to kill my Solitude, but it did not happen, so they just scooped. And now to the sideboards. They are playing Urza Sagas, we need to deal with that. So, White Orchid Phantoms, also Clarion Conquerors for the talismans and other stuff, and Wrath of the Skies. Those are the cards we really need. In game number 2, I had a very solid opening hand. I was either ready for turn 1 Fatal Push, turn 1 March, or turn 1 Aether Vial. All three very solid. And my opponent actually made a choice for me, because March can exile artifact lands. And because I cut down my opponent on mana, I had plenty of time to develop my own plan. I chose not to play the Aether Vial as I found it not that interesting. And honestly, I did not expect consign on this. I had interaction and long-term plan, so I just decided to chill for a little bit. And my opponent used the hole to get rid of my Aether Vial, which I actually couldn't care less about. Seeing the second Overlord on top was just great, because I knew my opponent did not really have any pressure, so I could just develop more and more. My opponent evidently kept a lot of interaction with the consigns, but I just had the Overlords. And the Emry was quite nice, but I knew I will be able to deal with it. My opponent spent their next turn just setting up, drawing cards, but I had the Overlords basically ready. By the way guys, did I mention I have 2 Overlords? Because I have 2 Overlords. I was so hyped about them, and yet I lost one of them. My opponent really ran out of resources, so I just got rid of the Tameo and continued pushing my advantage, which evidently was enough to win. Round 3 was quite interesting. I did not even know what my opponent was trying to do, but let's call it White Prison. Can I even say that? Enjoy the show! The start was nice and slow. I had Thalia ready, my opponent was not doing anything, so I just expected that I will play it and then start to use the Flicker Wisp, but they had other plans. I chose to go for a very aggressive play, which means playing the witch untapped and then using Flickerisp to flick it. Because I had nothing else in my hand, I had just interaction, so I chose to go for 5 power on board. And it paid off as my opponent missed the land drop, so I just kept up interaction. Thalia was easy to deal with, but my opponent found a land and they played their first prison card. But my Ephemerate was up and ready. It was actually a double punch as I took away one of their lands. I also chose to ramp up the aggression, and that's why I played the Bogart instead of using the Thoughtseize. And I think this is the other part of the prison, because my opponent was attacking land base as well as playing prison cards. And the flutes actually revealed that our opponent had basically nothing. My opponent kept on drawing land destruction, but I had my plan developed already. And they actually got to the point where I ran out of basic lands, but there was nothing they could do, so they just scooped to my failure. Onto the sideboards, I put in the Ashiok because it just stops them from finding lands. And I also swapped the 2 marches for Vindicate. Round 3, game 2. I had quite solid hand actually. Show me what you've got. Well, my opponent actually had nothing, so I just took the Thalia and ran with it. The only thing that they did have was land destruction, so that's why I chose to go for the Godless Shrine and keep as many basics in my library as possible. Thinking about it now, maybe I should have played a Recruiter just straight up, but I chose to keep up the Aven, and it meant that I played it flat. I even got enough mana to actually start deploying Solitude, so I knew that my opponent could not really develop anything of note. Once again, my opponent kept on hitting my lands, but there was basically nothing that they managed to achieve on their side of the board. So I kept on developing, kept on chugging along, the value train must grow all the time. I was also ready with my opponent's failure. Unfortunately, my opponent had an answer to it. But I still had nice board, steady damage and a lot of interaction with 2 Solitudes. I also managed to find a great counter for my opponent's strategy. Unfortunately, I did not realize they had the Blast Zone, so basically I just allowed them to use Blast Zone to get rid of 3 of my cards. I'm not sure why they allowed me to activate the Ashiok, but of course they did use the Blast Zone to get rid of 3 of my permanents. My opponent actually had quite a nice counterplay to my Solitude, because they expected an Ephemerate, so they just used the Flute preemptively. But I started to turn the tables and actually vindicated one of their lands. My opponent actually had a lot of removal and I did not draw a lot of creatures. Now we are getting to the prison part of the deck, Ghostly Prison, and my opponent had actually more than just one. We will get to it in a moment. Right now, one Solitude attack costs 2 mana, in a moment it will cost 4 mana, which is pricey, but I can still kill my opponent eventually, which is basically what happened. I also continue developing creatures on board. I put down Bogart, I also had Fatal Push ready for any opposition that they might have. And even though they had land destruction, it was basically pointless, because I had lethal on board in a way. And even though I couldn't afford lethal because I was missing just 1 mana, it was inevitable that my opponent would just die to the pressure that I had on board. Even the Fatal Push came in quite handy. Well, to be more precise, both of them were quite handy. Land destruction, prison, it is all cute, but with lethal on board, I knew that my opponent couldn't do anything. They realized as well, so they just scooped. Round 4, Boros Energy, you know the spiel, you know the game, but this one was very tough. The opening hand was quite nice, but my opponent started strong. Turn 1 Ocelot Pride, which is a brutal start for any energy deck. Even though I would prefer removal, I just had a Thoughtseize, so I took a look, and their hand was not the best, to be honest. I took the Traben Charm just to be able to use Thalia with the Overlord to gain a lot of value. Now here I had a choice. I could have just let my opponent attack, but I chose to use the Thalia to block and potentially sacrifice it to their Flash. But I saw that I had the Flickerisp as well, so I was quite safe. Another benefit of this play is the fact that my opponent did not develop the Fable yet. My initial plan was quite strong, just to prepare the Overlord to be flipped the next turn. My opponent actually did not really develop much on their side, just the Fable, which I kind of expected. So I just went for the Flickerwisp flip, but my opponent was ready for everything. They had the Goblin Bombardment to get rid of my Flicker Wisp and also the Traben Charm to get rid of my Overlord. Fortunately, I was ready with the same set next turn, so I just played the Overlord on my turn, got the Flicker Wisp that just died and flipped the Overlord again. This was quite brutal for my opponent as they did not really have a lot to do. The only thing that my opponent had going on was the Flash from the graveyard, which I was paying attention to, but I miscalculated quite heavily. I did not really count on my opponent using the first strike the way they did, which in hindsight was quite a large mistake. This was a heavy blow, but I still had plenty of stuff to do. Also, I managed to draw the card to get rid of the Flash right the turn after I needed it, as usual. Now when I think about it, I have also made another large mistake right here. I should have first used the Flicker Wisp, used the ETB effect of the Witch Enchanter, and then in the end step exiled the Flash using the March of the Otherworldly Light. And also due to my opponent's lucky top deck of the Seasoned Pyromancer, I actually managed to turn a winning game into a losing game. Now when I think about it, I really should focus more when it comes to these Boros energy matchups. Those decks can basically turn the game around real fast. In the sideboard I needed Wrath of the Skies, which means I put in all 3 copies. Also Thoughtseize is the card you don't really need, which means I put it out. I also added in the Clarion Conqueror, which is more useful card. In the second game I kept quite a strong interactive hand, which is something you always need against Boros energy. And the Fatal Push came in handy as my opponent started with the Ocelot Pridemane just the same as in the first game. I then follow it up with the Emperor of Bones, which is quite a strong card but not the best in this particular matchup. My opponent managed to deal with my Overlord, but I had a way to deal with their Ocelot, so we were just trading resources, which I'm actually quite okay with, as developing the Overlord again and then the Emperor is quite fine for me. The Voice of Victory is quite a nice card, but without the Goblin Bombardment it's not that strong. My opponent had a way to deal with my Emperor of Bones, but I dealt with their Voice of Victory. I felt so safe in this situation, I felt so well, but I just have to tell you, this game will not go as well as it's going right now. Even though my opponent had just 2 lands, they were able to fight quite well. The Galvanic Discharge with 1 more energy in the pool was quite good. They attacked, played the Fable, so just developed, but I was prepared with a Solitude. Now the Fable actually started to be a problem as my opponent once again had Flash and 4 mana ready, and they decided to go face, which was quite brutal as my opponent had a lot of pressure available, especially with double Flash in the graveyard. And now to the destructive part. Because I lost my Overlord, I had nothing to defend against the Flash, and Flash with Arena of Glory is a death sentence. And at this point no top deck would save me, but I had the funniest top deck, Aether Vial. That was it, I lost this game all by myself. Round number 5, Dimir, Frogs, Reanimation, all this kind of jazz. Enjoy the show! And I started strong with the Thoughtseize, and actually I could take away a land. They had frogs, sure, but I had interaction. Unfortunately my opponent kept the land on top, which meant the frogs were coming. But at least for the first couple of them I was ready. Fatal Push, March of the Otherworldly Light, I had some interaction for it at least. And another Fatal Push from the Survey land was just fantastic, because I knew I had everything I needed. The steady flow of interaction was just fantastic. I could just deal with 1 frog at a time and prepare for my own game plan. I marched the frog so that I would still have mana left to play the Aven or the Recruiter, but my opponent discarded the Archon of Cruelty with Persist in hand. I was in trouble. The Aven Interrupter can stop it for 1 turn, but not forever. But then came a top deck miracle. I found the Emperor of Bones, a perfect card, as I took their own Archon of Cruelty. My opponent knew that that was enough. enough to just scoop the game on spot. When it comes to sideboard against Frog, Clarion Conqueror is actually a great choice as they can't activate the Frog itself. Also, I put away the White Orchid Phantom, which doesn't really do much, one March, which is also not ideal, and that was it. In game 2 I kept quite a good hand, some interaction, some gameplay of my own, turn 1 Aether Vial, and I also found the Fatal Push, which was just fantastic. My opponent started slow, which was also very good for me. Turn 2 Frog is a nice play, but I was ready with the interaction and also developing my side of the board. In response to my Fatal Push, my opponent once again discarded Archon of Cruelty. I was a bit scared, but fortunately they only had the Emperor of Bones, which I could deal with. And because my opponent wasn't pressuring me, I could just filter out with the Surveillance, which helped me a lot. The same as in the first game, my opponent just had another Emperor of Bones to replace their first Emperor of Bones, just like the Frogs. I put down my Thalia, but it also got hit by my opponent's Fatal Push. The Emperor of Bones could be quite scary, but I was ready with the Clarion Conqueror. It stops activated abilities of creatures, planeswalkers and artifacts, so Aether Vial doesn't work anymore, but my opponent's Emperor doesn't work. That's the important part. You might be asking, why did I let my Thalia die? Well, I need to protect the Clarion Conqueror, so I just allowed myself to have to keep the Clarion Conqueror alive at any cost. Even though my opponent attacked me, there was basically no way for them to win the race, so I just continued racing. And then I did a fun thing. I used my Flicker Wisp to reset their Emperor of Bones and basically exile their Archon forever. My opponent actually started doing something impactful, which is the persist on the troll, but I was ready with 2 Solitudes, which basically spelled doom for my opponent. And now it was time to close the game. Let's get on the offensive, 2 turns and it's over. But after my opponent saw the top of their deck, they realized there is basically nothing to do. And that's it. 4-1 result. Quite good. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like, subscribe and take a look at other videos of the best deck in Modern Orzhov Blink. I will see you in the next one.